Hey guys, just type in the chat box for me and confirm you can hear me. Perfect. I'll give it 2 more minutes for a few more to jump on, and then we'll get started. I put in the chat box as well. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to type those in there, and then myself and Gavin can address those at the end. Okay, I'm just making sure that we're ahead with the recording of the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, looks like we're good to go. So Brandon, JT, Tony, thanks for taking the time to jump on. Really appreciate that. And I'm sure what's a very busy day. This is obviously the first South Texas webinar. We're going to be covering mental skills topics, and then Coach Gavin will take over with the nutrition education. But we hope that you get a lot from it, and some practical things that you can take away to your teams. As I mentioned, any questions through the presentation, just feel free to throw those in the chat box, and we can talk about those at the end. And if not, obviously, if anything comes up over the next week or two or in the future, then we'll have our email, and I think I've got my cell phone on there at the end, and you can feel free to contact us as well with any questions. So my name's Rick Hadwick. I've been coaching for almost 20 years, and psychology's been a big part of that for me as a coach. I've always dedicated time to learning more about mental skills and how psychology plays a role, especially in young athletes, partly due to some of my challenges growing up with performance anxiety and lacking confidence, that kind of stuff. And from those experiences, I've really wanted to learn why that was happening. You know, why some days I felt great, why some days I just didn't feel like I was up to the task, and now I want to pass that on to the players that I coach, and then further now, obviously, my role as sports performance director with Sting and Titans to help other coaches understand some of the simple concepts that we can use and techniques we can use to help athletes with some of those challenges. So I've officially been working with athletes on mental skills for about 5 years. And yeah, it's great to be part of a club that invests so much into this right now. And so if we dive straight into a few facts about the brain, the thing that stands out to me is just the fact that we have the most powerful organism in the universe, and we've not dedicated enough time either to researching it, to understanding it, and to into therapy and the stigma that goes along with therapy even today. And obviously in our world, sports psychology and sports coaching, very little of our work as coaches goes into mental skills training and looking at the role that sports psychology plays. And anytime I talk to a parent, they'll say words like aggressive or focus when they're talking about how they want their player to improve. So they want their child to play more aggressive, which to me just means motivation. We hear elite athletes all the time talk about, we weren't able to maintain our focus for the full 90 minutes. We lost our concentration in defense. We always hear these buzzwords that relate to mental skills, but the question is always, how much time do we spend actually practicing those techniques and working on those things? And now, obviously, at the elite level, we see it's quite common for teams to have sports psychologists and mental skills coach. But my argument is that it shouldn't just be for elite athletes. It can make a huge difference to young athletes, especially in the US, where we have a culture now that's very competitive, that applies a lot of pressure on young players. And so I think it's time to really educate coaches and parents and athletes on those things. And so the big one on this slide is that every person has a unique brain anatomy. And what that tells me is when we're looking at young soccer players, they're perceiving pressurized situations very differently to each other. They're motivated differently, some by extrinsic rewards, some by intrinsic rewards. Some are motivated by ego, others by completing the task. And so by understanding these differences and the different structure of the brain in each person, we start to realize that and have a little bit of empathy and understanding on how children learn and how this affects their psychology in terms of things like motivation. One common challenge with mental skills is actually showing real changes that occur that are due to mental skills training. It's very hard to define and to quantify. And so one thing that started happening recently is taking brain scans to show some of the changes that occur. And this example here is from mindfulness meditation, and it really just shows huge increases in grey matter, a decreased amygdala size, that's where a lot of our emotion takes place, reduced enhanced functionality in the network connections, and what it's leading to is reduced stress, reduced anxiety, and improved concentration, resilience, happiness, and a lot more with that. And that's just one example of something that you might work on with athletes in terms of meditation and relaxation. So when we talk about mental skills training specifically, we're talking about consistent practice of psychological skills. And the reason we do that is to obviously enhance performance, but we want players to enjoy the game more. We want greater sport and physical activity satisfaction. When we talk about enjoyment, that's enjoyment in seeing the improvement in our game, the improvement in our team, but just enjoying the experience. And as I mentioned before, we have some environments that can be negative, that can be high pressure, even at very young ages. And so while we're not going to change that culture overnight, we can help athletes through mental skills training to be more resilient, more confident, and to be able to cope with those situations. And that's referred to as coping skills, which we'll talk about later on. So why mental skills training? The biggest argument for me is if we're working on the technique, on the tactics, on the physical, why not the psychological? And I think if we are working on mental skills, it's going to benefit the technical, the tactical, and the physical. And I give the example of motivation. If we can increase motivation, anywhere around 5–10%, small margins, and think of the impact that will have on the repetition of technique. A player going home excited to work on their technique and produce that repetition, which is crucial for that level of improvement. A player that's excited to watch games and improve their tactical knowledge. And again, with the physical, if you're motivated to get fitter, then it's going to be huge differences in the game, but also in that confidence and self-esteem. And so that's just one example of the psychological aspects benefiting all of the three other pillars of the game. When we feel good, we play good. This was huge for me growing up, and what I try and pass on and encourage in young athletes is not just in a sporting sense, but when you feel good with things at home, with school, especially for high school athletes, chances are you're going to have more clarity in your mind, and you're going to play better as a result. Pressure to perform, I've mentioned a few times now, just the pressures to win, the pressures to compete at a level where you don't lose your spot or you get more playing time. It might be parental pressures, but again, we want to help athletes to cope with those pressures, and there are certain techniques we can use to do that. There's unfortunately a huge dropout rate at just 11 when they get to age 13. I was recently at a US soccer instructor class, and they said at age 13, 75% of players drop out, which was a staggering statistic. And I think a large part of that is this environment that we have in youth soccer. And again, while we're not going to change that soon, we can provide the techniques that allow athletes to cope better. And the simple truth is that sport is not always fun. And even if we create the most positive atmosphere, sport can be tough, where sometimes we make mistakes, and that mistake might lead to the opponent scoring a goal. Sometimes we lose games that we feel like we should have won, and that's difficult. And through the right message, through the right education, we can show athletes that that's okay. And this is where we build our character, build that inner strength, that mental toughness, and where huge life lessons come out of that as a result that benefit the athletes in many ways outside of sport. So just a quick graphic on stress and performance, just a very, very simple example. This here talks about stress on performance in a penalty shootout. And so if you have an athlete that has a negative perception, that results in distress, and then you have reduced performance. If you have an athlete that has a positive perception of this pressurized situation, then you have increased energy, increased motivation, and increased performance. And so as coaches and as parents, we try and recognize, what situations do I see my young athlete or my players going down that negative perception? And you'll hear from the words they're using, from even just the body language, the look on their face. You'll see times where, they have a negative perception of this situation. And typically it's the athlete telling themselves, I don't have the tools to cope with this situation. And then you have the stress, and then you have the reduced performance. And we have to keep encouraging athletes to go into this with a positive perception, to say, what, I do have the tools to cope. I did perform well at practice. My last game was strong. I can do it again. And then that will obviously lift the energy, lift the motivation, and in turn increase performance. So just a real simple graphic of how we can look at athletes early on. Might be a practice, might be a game, a certain situation, and we can help guide them down to that positive perception road. Some examples of how we work on mental skills, and it might be to cope with pressure, it might be to increase confidence, many different aspects of character traits that we can work on, but visualization, as I'm sure you've all heard of, and this simply is being in a very relaxed state, and you're imagining either yourself from a previous performance, and we're always trying to imagine a positive previous performance. Some athletes prefer to visualize a future performance where they see themselves performing well, but it can do great things for confidence, and there's research out there to show that visualization works, not just, again, with elite athletes, but with young athletes too. And it does take practice. It can feel a little bit strange at first doing that if you're not used to it. But the truth is, with visualization, we all visualize every day. And that's just in our imagination, whether we're daydreaming or consciously visualizing. But with practice, we can make it more and more vivid, more and more believable. And by doing so, we see ourselves performing great things before it's happened. And I don't know if there's any golf fans out there, but Jack Nicklaus would always say that he'd go to the movies inside of his head before every shot, and that was what he was doing. He was visualizing every shot before it happened, and not just the shot, but the mechanics. He was feeling the backswing, the follow through. Everything was smooth, the contact on the ball, and there's no reason why soccer players can't do that too with practice, to generate that real vivid and real scene where they're performing something very, very strong and effective on the soccer field, and they can gain confidence from that. Goal setting, as I'm sure you've all tried before, short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals. The key with goal setting is, to me, that I always tell athletes, you want the goals to make you feel good, to make you feel motivated. So they should know if the goal is too far ahead of what they can achieve, then they're going to feel more stress. If it's too easy, too simple, they're not going to be motivated by it. And so you've got to hit that sweet spot and encourage athletes to hit that sweet spot of what makes you feel motivated and feel good. What's just challenging enough, but not too far that you're getting too stressed about it. And it's got to be a constant process. You're always reevaluating goals, depending on how close you are to achieving. If you've achieved a goal, what's the next one? And you keep building on that. And again, huge for confidence. Self-talk. This is a huge one in sport, especially during performance. Young athletes have a habit of repeating very negative statements to themselves. They have habits of a negative cycle. And so we have to talk to athletes about, how are you talking to yourself in a game? And similar to visualization, this happens whether we discuss it or not. Everyone is talking to themselves during a performance in some way. And so again, if we can realize the things that we're saying and then try to adjust those into more positive statements, into encouraging statements, and almost like we're being our best support system during a game, then it can help reduce anxiety. It can increase resilience and mental toughness. But again, that one's a big one in many sports. Concentration and focus. I think the big thing to take away from focus is that this is something that needs to be practiced. It's a mental muscle. And obviously when you train, you can talk to players about, how long during a practice before you start to lose focus. And then obviously this translates to a game. There's many team building sessions. I'm sure you've seen the concentration grids that you can use. And there's some fun pictures where you try to spot the differences, and you can time athletes to see how long they're able to concentrate on different images, some harder than others. But this is building the mental muscle of concentration that is crucial for any sport. Managing emotions and anxiety. This was a very tough one for me growing up, as I mentioned at the beginning. Anxiousness would take away so much energy that I had. So at practice, I was probably the fittest player, and then in games, some games, I was probably the least fit player because of the anxiousness that had just drawn out so much energy. And I see young athletes go through this. And there's simple breathing techniques. Visualization can help with this, but being able to manage those emotions and calm things down, and also just being aware of our emotions. One challenge that I had was I didn't have the awareness to say, I shouldn't be feeling this anxious before a game. And I want to be there now to say to athletes, if you do feel too anxious, it's not something that you just have to deal with. We can work on these breathing techniques. Or some athletes use music, but ways to calm down so that you don't get too pumped before the game and lose all that energy. And you really want that those emotions to gradually build up and gradually more motivated right up until the whistle, where when that whistle goes, that's where you're going to be in that fight or flight response and ready to play strong. And finally, attitude. We want players to be positive, focused, and in sports psychology, we refer to it as a high performance mindset. And so if you're bringing the right attitude, then hopefully we can help athletes and guide them towards that high performance mindset. And so some examples there in the graphic. A big one obviously on there for soccer is improving teamwork and team cohesion. And again, this is all part of mental skills. Now as a group, many of what I discussed on that list was as an individual, but there's ways we can work on this with our teams. Now, Sting and Titans, within their philosophy and within their curriculum, you can see it ties in very much with mental skills training. And just to throw some of the words in here, we've got perception, so reads and analyzes situations. That takes mental clarity and awareness. Decision making, reflection, soccer IQ. You can see this curriculum is filled with pieces on there that are very in line with mental skills training. On this next page, we've got competitive, driven, thinking ahead. Responsibility would also be part of mental skills training, and learning some self-awareness and how responsible are those players, setting goals, all those kind of things. So yeah, all very much in line with what the club wants to achieve for their players. This is something that I wanted you all to take back to your teams. You may have seen it before, but it's a performance profile where the players rate themselves in each task. So this profile here has a list of around 10 mental attributes. Now, some athletes will have 3 or 4 mental attributes. They'll have some technical attributes, some tactical, some physical. I know athletes in the past have had 3 different profiles, one for psychology, one for technique, one for physical. And basically athletes will rate themselves so it looks more like this. And then over time, it might be a month, or it might be after the season, they go back and say, right, did I improve in these areas where I needed the improvement? So in this example, you can see that consistent effort is pretty low. And that athlete will be looking at it and saying, okay, over the next season, I'm going to improve my effort. And they're going to have specific mental skills training techniques to work on that. But again, after the season, they can look back at it and say, do you know what I did? I'm going to bump that up. I definitely improved that area. And not just the weaknesses, but looking at the strengths too, and keeping those as quality as they possibly can. But it just allows athletes to really focus on some of these psychological components that are required for their position. And what I ask athletes is, you know, what's required for your game, for your position, to be the best that you can be. And they'll write a list first, and then we'll put it into a profile and say, right, where do you rate yourself on these areas? And so if they're taking initiative, if they're taking ownership of it and they've listed those qualities, then they're more likely to then say, do you know what, these are the qualities I believe I need. Now I'm going to take the time to improve those. And so I'd encourage you all to do that and take it back to your athletes and give it a go. There are some teams that put a profile together that's for their team. And so they would list 9 or 10 attributes that they believe their team needs or they want their team to improve. So it might be communication, it might be team confidence, concentration, but you can have a separate profile that as a team you say, right, by the end of the season we're going to improve X, Y, Z, you know, whatever the areas are that you identify as a group to improve on. So what next? I always tell people that are new to mental skills and sports psychology training to have an open mind. You know, with things like mindfulness meditation and visualization, it can seem a little bit out there, a little bit different, but the truth is the research is there and it's proven to work. And if we can create more resilient athletes able to deal with pressurized situations, and that's the way to do it, then I say why not? Introduce simple concepts. So some of the simple concepts we've spoken about, such as goal setting, the performance profile, but start with the simple things, and then over time, through these webinars and different presentations, we'll start to gradually introduce more of the complex ideas within sports psychology. But yeah, definitely to begin, we don't want to overwhelm coaches or parents or athletes with too much, but just some basic things to begin with. Always consider what we can influence, what we can control, what we can affect. I think too often we focus on things that we can't control. And the classic example is the score of a game. Myself and Coach Gavin, we coach an 01-02 MPL team. They're in Classic D2 here in Dallas. And one of the players recently sent a message to the group saying, let's make sure we win and stay top until the end of the season. Now, you could look at that and say that's very positive, that's a goal, they want to stay top. But my response was, it's not about wanting to win. Everybody wants to win. Of course, we want to finish the league in first place. But I challenge them to say, how? You know, what are you going to do? What are you going to take action on so that we're there? And that's what the players need to focus on, is the how. You know, what can you control as a player to make sure that you improve? And so as a consequence, the performance is better. And then as a result, hopefully we get more wins. But we cannot control the score, we can only control the how. ANTS refers to automated negative thoughts. So as I mentioned before, with self-talk, sometimes we have habits of repeating negative things to ourselves, and we have these negative thoughts creep in purely through habit or through a lack of confidence. And so it's important to be aware of those and to try and prevent that cycle, that habit from continuing, and replacing those with positive thoughts. But it first starts with the awareness of what negative thoughts are creeping in that's beginning this cycle of negativity. Preparation and routine. Some of the skills I mentioned earlier, so the visualization might start to be part of some players' preparation. Goal setting, you might remind yourself of the goals as part of your routine, but I think that is crucial in terms of mental skills training. The performance profile, please give it a go and send me some feedback. I'd love to hear how that goes, and I can obviously help with that too. And then as an end result, that's what we're trying to achieve, the high performance mindset. That was a term that Dan Abrahams, some of you may have heard of Dan Abrahams, who's a sports psychologist in the UK, but he's someone that introduced me to that phrase, and I really like it because it's not just talking about that's what high performance mindset is referring to. And so I have next some links, some information. As I to talk to in the past, a fascinating sports psychologist, and a complete book for athletes that so take away. And then two more examples from actual players. The women's national team and Fabinho at Liverpool, talking about the role of sports psychology and mental skills. And then finally, there's my email and cell number there. And yeah, I'd love to hear back from your performance profile. And then also, if you could send myself and Coach Gavin, anything specific you would like us to talk about and zone in on. Today's obviously been kind of a general introduction to mental skills, but over time, we want to make sure that we target areas that are relevant to you as coaches or parents. And so, please send us any ideas that you have for us to hit those specific areas. That's pretty much it from me. Now we'll switch to Coach Gavin on the nutrition. But I appreciate your time, and yeah, please shoot me an email when you get a chance. I'd love some feedback.
Can you hear me, Rick?
I can, Gav. Yeah, I just saw Brandon's question, and yeah, we'll get that performance profile image over to the coaches. I've got a copy that I can send to Stuart, and he can pass it on to everyone.
All right, let me just make me a presenter, and then I'll start it. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 second. I've just I've switched laptops, haven't I? So I'm just trying to figure it out. It looks different on this one than my other one. Okay.
Is it on full screen?
Yeah, have you got it? You can't see it?
We can see it, but then there's like 3 black squares.
Black where?
Above the presentation.
Still? Is that right?
Oh, you're good. You're good. That looks good now.
Oh, okay. I think it's because I've got a side panel now which takes over it, and it didn't on my last laptop. But yeah. Thanks again for joining us, guys. We appreciate you taking the time out to listen to us about topics that me and myself and Coach Rick really believe in it and think it'd be beneficial for the players in the club. If you don't know me, this is me here with one of my players. If we are ever in the same region and you see me at the fields, please come and say hello. And if you've got any questions for us, we're happy to answer and speak to anybody as much as possible. We really want to get the information out there to really help the kids develop. A little bit about me there, just education. I'm not going to go through it all, just to show you a bit of my background and why I'm sort of qualified to give you this information. I'll let you guys read that in your own time. Just to start, I want to just add a bit of a quote here, which sums up my main goals for this. Although we're looking at sports nutrition and a way to improve performance, my overall goal really is just to make our overall health better, which will in itself improve performance anyway. So the quote there is just really just summarizing that, and just how we eat really just affect our health. And obviously, the better we eat, the more our performance increases as well. I wanted to start with just a brief history of sports nutrition, just to give you guys a bit of a background. I'll run through it quickly, but you can go all the way back to the 1800s. Dutch swimmers were testing caffeine as a means to improve performance. Obviously, not a natural food source there, but they were using caffeine to, like I said, just improve endurance mainly. I'm sure you're familiar with the effects of caffeine. It's been obviously still tested to this day in different forms, and the amounts and what dosage makes a difference. In the 60s, glycogen testing started to happen. For those who don't know, glycogen is basically just is carbohydrates. So we're just testing how much carbs are needed to improve performance. Does it affect endurance? Does it affect our muscle contraction and that kind of thing? In the late 60s or 65, Gatorade was born out of the University of Florida. If there's any Gator fans on here. This was then testing the effects of sports drinks and how, taking a carbohydrate-based drink affected our endurance and prolonged activity. In the 80s, pro consulting started to happen. So teams were no longer just relying on their coaches, so to speak. We're looking into registered dietitianists, sports nutritionists, and really trying to get an edge over the competition and make sure that there isn't a single part of their game that they can't improve upon. In the 2000s, this is kind of a big change. Lots of labs were sort of physiology based, biomechanics, that kind of thing. We started to get a lot more labs which are dedicated just to performance nutrition and really testing individual nutrients and how that affects performance. So we're looking at still working on things such as caffeine and supplement based, but a lot of just whole food sources as well. For example, 2009 was a rather big study in the UK in University of Exeter, where beetroot juice, they were testing it to see the benefits of how it increases blood flow, muscle contraction, because of beetroot producing nitric oxide in the body, which improves those two things. Pretty much every pro team now makes players take beetroot juice before games, after practices, and varying times. So that was a pretty big study that came out. And now it's every professional team has a dedicated nutritionist. Every professional team consults registered dietitians. Every professional team has their own sports nutrition department. And it goes along with, on top of the sports science program they already have. They really make it a big deal to make sure that their players, their athletes are eating the right things. Performance nutrition is basically just fuel. I've put that picture there. Think of it as a car, and we're looking at a car to get us places, and without the gas, we're not going to get anywhere. And I just want you to look at it as that, really. So we fuel daily to boost performance. What I mean by that is we're not just eating certain foods at the weekend just to perform for the game. It's not going to work. We have to fuel daily with the right nutrients throughout the day, every day, to really give us that overall performance boost. We want to eat foods to stay healthy, decrease the risk of injuries, and just viruses and our immunity. All those things will be affected for our health if we don't eat the right things. Fueling to recover, big one after sport, after practice, after games, especially tournament weekends, any prolonged activity. You've really got to refuel those muscles and making sure that your body can recover to alleviate that soreness and things like that. And then probably the most important thing for me is no one, especially children, is going to eat foods they don't like the taste of and they don't enjoy. We want to make sure that all the foods we're eating is enjoyable, so we want to eat them, and we can make that sustainable. That's really the true way to achieve these the benefits of good nutrition and performance. 1 second, my computer's froze. The slide's not moving. Oh, there we go. So what influences athletic ability? I'm sure you'd all answer first if I asked you that question and say genetics. And I would agree, genetics plays a big role on the importance of how athletic we are and what sports we're good at. When you're looking at muscle mass or fast twitch fibers, slow twitch fibers, that kind of thing. Optimal training, how do we boost the genetics we have? Do we train for speed? Do we train for power? Do we train for technical ability? Are we training right? Obviously also influences our athletic ability. And then the third one there, good nutrition is often overlooked, and we want to make sure that we have a rounded base of what we can do to make sure that performance on the field is as good as possible. There is no secret ingredient. We have to cover the bases, and this is why we feel it's important to get this information out to our teams. Very simple slide. Weight loss, strength loss, fatigue, immunity, soreness, joint pain, nutrient deficiency, and diminished performance. All consequences of poor nutrition. Obviously, if we're looking across those things there, we don't want to, if we're weaker, it's not a good thing in soccer. If we're endurances, we've got tired out before the end of the final whistle, not a good thing. Immunity, if we're constantly sick, we're not going to perform well. Soreness, as I mentioned earlier, if we're not eating right, soreness, joint pain, again, especially on like a tournament weekend, then energy needs. I'm giving you guys here just sort of a basic calorie requirements. It's 15 to 30 calories per pound of body weight. It's a rough guide. I say rough guide because you'll hear me say it's very individual over the course of this webinar quite a lot. And it's very individual. It's hard. It's trial and error. It's finding the amount that works for the athlete. The diagram on the left there kind of summarizes that. It's calories in versus calories out. Every person will burn calories at a different rate to another person. Every person will be able to eat a certain amount without gaining weight or losing weight or staying between that positive negative calorie balance. The way that is worked out is through the little chart on the right there. So rest and metabolic rate plus the thermal effect of food plus physical activity. So everybody has that baseline, which is the RMR. The foods we eat make a difference to how much calories we burn, which is the TEF, and physical activity. Obviously, if one person's doing 5 times the amount as another, and different varied intensities, obviously that's going to burn a large variance of calories between a person, also between sexes as well, male and female, as we'll see from this chart here. We have 7 to 10-year-olds, 11 to 14-year-olds, and 15 to 18-year-olds. Low, moderate, and very high activity levels. The top numbers are the male athletes. The bottom numbers are the female athletes. As just mentioned on the previous slide there, we see that the female athletes generally don't need quite as much calories to fill their energy requirements. As the years go by and the activity changes, we can also see that there's a large spike between the male athletes, especially once we get to very high levels of activity, whereas the female ones, although do jump quite significantly, the gap increases a lot more substantially between the male and the female athletes. So that's just something to take into account, and as I said, it's trial and error. You need to sort of figure out what works and just kind of stick to that. So what fuels our muscles? As I've mentioned a couple of times, carbohydrates is the main fuel for our muscle. I want you to think of a muscle as like a sponge. The sponge is something where if it's not wet, it doesn't work, really. So we want to make sure that our sponge or our muscles are full of fuel. So we want to keep the carbohydrate stores high, especially in and around practices, games, any athletic events, you know, as we get into older ages as well, if they're lifting weights and that kind of thing, to try and improve the power output. Now, carbs can only be stored to a certain amount. There is a maximum that your body can reach before it starts using other sources as fuel, and starts converting those carbohydrates to fat if they're not used by the body. Fats, on the other hand, can just be stored unlimited. There's not a limit on that, which is why obviously we see the obesity sort of rates that we do see in worldwide now. So when you just remember that we do need to fill them up, there is a maximum to them, which is why we need to spread our energy out, spread our nutrition out throughout the week. You can't just eat a massive amount of food on a weekend and expect that to improve performance. As I mentioned, glycogen is the primary energy source, and we then start to use protein and fat as an energy source after that. The role of protein, muscle growth is the simple answer to that. We use protein to rebuild, repair our muscle that perhaps is damaged during activities, especially weight training, as well as we get to those older ages. We certainly need protein to recover and stimulate new muscle growth. As just mentioned, when carbohydrates are low, we do start to use a percentage there as to fuel our body. Aids in repair and recovery, yeah, I've already mentioned that one. Just a few examples of sources of protein. Main sources there, obviously, meat, poultry, eggs, some in nuts. There's you know, varied sources that we can get our protein from. Just a little diagram on the effects of your diet on physical endurance. So on the right there, maximum endurance time 57, 114, and 167. And that's based off what type of diet we have. If we follow a fat and protein only diet with a low carb amount, as we can see, it's the lowest amount of endurance time. As I mentioned, carbohydrates fuel our body. A balanced diet, a little bit higher, and then high carbohydrate diet, as you can see, quite substantially higher than what it would be if we weren't eating carbohydrates. So just a good note on that. We're just going to cover over the next few slides fluids and hydration, something which again is often overlooked and very important topic, and is a lot more detail than just these slides are going to go into right now, and we'll perhaps do further webinars on this. Male and female is very similar in terms of the amount of percentage of the body weight. Male is just a little bit higher. And then hydration of fluids, you know, what does that affect? Cardiovascular function. So how well are we transporting nutrients, oxygen? Are we removing waste from our body? All things that happen there in the CV function. Thermoregulation. Are we keeping our body temperature at its core temperature? I'm sure you've all been overheated before, or sunstroke, or your core body temperature changes or drops, and that can cause you know, severe damages sometimes to our body. Injury prevention, again, most cramps are caused from hydration. We see during soccer, especially once you know, we're going to those 90-minute games or it's into extra time, and we see a lot of people cramping up, even professional athletes. Hydration is a big reason for that. We lose an awful lot of sweat during games, especially in our climate here in Texas, where it gets very humid, very hot. We need to make sure we're adequately preparing for that. Recovery. As I just mentioned there, sweat loss. We want to replenish and recover all the fluids that we've just lost during that game. If not, you know, all these things can happen. Impaired performance. I'll move on to the next slide for this one. Just a varied description of what I mean by impaired performance. Muscle strength is lost, speed, stamina, energy, and the cognitive process is altered. As well as that, we increase the risk of injury quite severely if we're not hydrating. 95% of muscle cramps are due to dehydration, as just mentioned. Just want to touch on the cognitive process. So a lot of people might think that this only affects us in terms of our athleticism and like mentioned there, energy, speed, etc. But as Rick was just talking about, nutrition also does have a link to our psychological processes, how are we thinking, the perception of our surroundings, obviously a massively important skill in soccer. Our memory, our attention changes once you've been dehydrated. And I'm sure you perhaps have all had a familiar situation where this happens, so you can understand where I'm coming from and saying it's very important that we need to make sure that our athletes are making sure that they're drinking the right amounts of water all week. Again, it's just like nutrition. It's not a case of you can just hydrate by chugging down a big drink of water, and that's actually pretty unsafe to do so anyway. That upsets the stomach quite a lot. So when should you drink, and the amounts? Again, this is a guide. This needs to be, again, tailored to the person. Are they male, female? How much do they weigh? What exercise are they doing? What's the intensity of it? But just as a guide, we want to be drinking a decent amount of water 2 or 3 hours before, 400 to 600 milliliters that I've put there. 15 minutes before, again, as I just mentioned, we don't want to be just drinking down a lot of water right before the activity. We want to just be taking sips and just making sure we're replenished and good to go. Pretty similar amounts for the during the activity. We have a lot of water breaks here in Texas during the hot summer months. We don't have any when it starts to get cooler. We want to make sure that the kids are getting the drinks in when they can. Obviously, half time, before the game, after the game, making sure they're recovering. Post sport, you lose a lot of fluids, depend on your body weight, and again the activity. A guide there is 5 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. Try and figure that out to your athlete, and just again, it's trial and error. See how you feel after drinking that amount after the sport. If you're still feeling dehydrated, you might need more. If you maybe you've drank too much, and you've just got to kind of work that out. So what do we know? My advice is don't rely on thirst. That's very often a cue that we can't rely on. Sometimes, most times actually, during my practices every day, I'll ask the kids to go get a drink. Like last night, for instance, we've changed from a hot climate to, it was fairly mild. It was pretty chilly last night, and I'm asking them to go get drinks, and they don't think they need any, and I'm making sure that they're going to get some. Again, don't drink it all in one go. Just little drinks to make is the best way. Drink before, during, and after. Again, this is it's a thing we have to be consistent with. Is probably the best word. Don't just drink a lot at one time. Drink the right amounts before, during, after, during the week, at school, after school, before practices. Making sure that we have water on hand. I've only mentioned water so far because for most people it's perfectly fine. We don't need any other sort of hydration fluid for hydration, I should say. Water's fine for less than an hour. If you're only doing an hour of activity or even an hour and a half of practice, you're having a few water breaks, you'll be fine. It's the only thing really you need. We can start looking at sports drinks once you go into a higher intensity activity, once it's longer than 1 hour. I would also say once the child gets a little bit older. I'm certainly not recommending that to the teams I have, who are my younger teams, who are U11. I just feel with a lot of additives in there and tooth decay and the benefits that they bring is not really sufficient enough to deal with the negative things. I will do a sports drinks webinar to go into greater detail because it's a massive topic and it's very misunderstood. There's multiple different forms of Gatorade, Powerade, and all the other main sports drinks. It's not a one size fits all. They're meant to be used for different times and different reasons. So I'll go into further detail on that. I just wanted to touch base on it here. Our pre-exercise goals, we just want to provide energy to the working muscles. As I said, fill those glycogen stores up, maximize them. Try not to overdo it. We don't want to be too full. We don't want to feel like just carbs are just sitting in our stomach and we've ate too much. That's not going to help with our performance either. We do want to minimize the hunger though. We don't want to feel just desperate for some food during the game. So we want to make sure we're eating a good, well-rounded meal. prior to the game. And again, we have to figure out what that amount is for us, for each individual person. Maximize hydration. Aim for, to put it a simple way, clear urine before a game. If it's clear, you're pretty hydrated as a general rule of thumb. And then again, it's all individualized. You have to work out what fits right for your athletes. Everything makes a difference: age, climate, size of the athlete, age of the athlete, intensity of exercise. All those things make a big difference. Guidelines in terms of what type of meals and the timing of it. Meals should be sort of 2/3 of a normal size meal before exercise. Again, the reasons just mentioned before. We're not trying to feel too full. We want to be eating that meal 3 to 4 hours before competition if possible. If we don't have the availability, the access to do that, snacks 1 or 2 hours before. I personally prefer, closer I get towards competition, I have more liquids, smaller snacks, just things I can eat and digest quicker, lots easier, so it doesn't sit in my stomach. Again, I'm one person, everybody's individual, and we have to find what fits ourselves. The recovery process, just to touch on this, defined as helping athletes bounce back for future exercise bouts. What we're looking to consider here is the intensity of exercise and when athlete will exercise again. If, for example, we are at practice, and it's a recovery session, and you've just had 2 hard games, and the practice is going to be a low intensity, then that affects what we eat, what we drink. If, for example, though, it's a tournament weekend and we've got 2 games in one day, sometimes my teams have even played 3 games in one day, which is crazy. If we're exercising again right after, 3 hours after, 2 hours after, we really need to make sure that we get those foods in to recover and the fluids in to recover, and in the right amounts. Our goals for recovery process is to restore the carbohydrates that we've used, that we've burnt during the exercise. We want to replenish those. Fluid and electrolyte replacement, as mentioned before, and then again we touched on protein and muscle repair and adaptation. We will break down muscle and carbs during the exercise. I just want to make sure we repair and rebuild. So just a little resources on the right there. We have 2 guides that I've made for the club already out on the website. If you haven't got access to them, let me know. Drop me an email and I can send them out to you guys. And I'll send them out to the directors, and they can just share them out to your region. They're quite beneficial. Go into a bit more detail on some of the things we've covered here and a lot of different things. Really good around just game day and tournament weekends. Webinars, obviously, as we're doing right now, this is the first of many, and we'll do different things. As Rick mentioned, any topics that you particularly want to cover, we're happy to kind of we want to cover things that you guys want to know and want to learn and want to listen to. So obviously send us ideas and what you want to cover. And then we will be offering nutrition coaching as well. It's not started yet, but we will do team-based and individual-based coaching as well to give people that extra competitive advantage if you really want to, get serious and nail down the nutrition element. And that's it. Thank you for listening. Again, my email is there. Please reach out to me. Any questions you've got. I'm happy to answer anything, anytime, and just send us ideas of what we want to do. If there's any questions, quick questions in the chat box, we'll answer them now. If not, we'll just get it off and we'll get the recording out to your area so other people can watch it as well. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, JT. You're welcome, Brandon. Thanks, Tony. Yes, Minnie, there'll be a recording of this and it'll be sent out.